Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Imagine it's the 7th century and a monastery is the only life you've ever known. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. That is the setting of a new novel entitled The Oblate's Confession. The era is one of petty Anglo-Saxon kingdoms who make war upon one another and their Celtic neighborhoods. The Christianity is relatively new as a force in the land with tenuous ties to the region. And this monastery is an isolated island brushed occasionally by the outside world. The author is William Peake, a local writer and also works for the Talbot County Free Library as a communications manager. And he is our special guest this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, you said that it was your goal to enter fully into the minds, souls, and everyday lives of human beings like us who happen to live in a time and place dramatically different from our own. So how did you choose this particular period, and how did you choose to write this book?
It's a good question. A lot of different interests drew me eventually, slowly but surely, to the 7th century. Initially, I was, years ago, I had a chronic illness, and one of the ways that I started to deal with it was I did relaxation exercises. And in the course of one of those relaxation exercises, a book I was reading, I came across a mention of this early Christian practice called Contemplative Prayer. And I'd always thought of meditation as an Eastern religion sort of a thing. It never occurred to me that Christianity had something similar. So I began to study it. The more I learned about it, the more I wanted to learn about its origins. The more I studied its origins, I found myself drawn to early England. And I found this wonderful historian, the Venerable Bede, who some of you may have heard of when you were taking history in school. Remarkable man who lived in the 7th century and was arguably the first true historian of England. Wrote many books, spoke 3 languages fluently, created the first tide chart for England, a tide chart that was so accurate it was still being used by the Royal Navy into the 16th century, and he lived his entire life in a monastery. He was an oblate. He was an oblate in the 7th century, was a child that had been donated to a monastery by his family with the understanding that the child would then live there the rest of his life and grow up to become a monk, which sounds sort of horrific to us. But it was a common practice then and was considered a real honor for the child as well as for the family. And obviously, at least in the case of the Bede, certainly, it turned out really well. He had a full, contented life, apparently, from all indications. Remarkable man.
So tell me then a little bit about the main character. He's the son of a warrior, as you mentioned, and he is given to the monastery as part of this conflict that occurs between various rival kingdoms. Tell me a little bit about him and what his origins are. Because we sort of meet him very early in his life. Yeah,
he actually, when in the first scene of the novel, he's just been given to the monastery, and he's probably only about 4 or 5 years old. I think one of the reasons I ended up writing this novel was when I learned about the existence of oblates, the fact that people did this, that they gave their children away. I found myself thinking about what it would be like to be a small child suddenly dropped, abandoned in this world where there are all these dark men in dark clothes wandering around, and they don't talk. These monks take a vow of silence, so they occasionally talk, but mostly they use sign language. So here, I mean, talk about an alien world, and for a small child, I would have thought that would be really terrifying. And I was just intrigued by that notion, and I wanted to see what that was like. So that's this child's experience. So you're seeing this in this novel. You see the world, the 7th century. Which is also to our eyes a very alien place. You meet it through the eyes of a child who everything he's experiencing is unusual and strange to him, which makes him a pretty good observer. You know, when you see something you've never seen before, you remark upon it. And so he remarks upon things, observes them, and I think in a way that's very telling. It makes for good storytelling.
And he seems to, as time goes on, he seems to adapt then to all these various changes that take place, when it's pestilence, when order's coming down. I mean, he seems to be very adaptive in terms of fitting in with whatever the situation is.
Yes, I think you're right. Certainly he survives, which, those of us that manage to reach adulthood almost have to become adaptive. And he's got a lot to adapt to. You're right. There was a lot of plague in this time period. He's been dropped into a strange situation in the monastery. There are warring factions all around him. It's a dangerous time to be alive. And at the same time, just like our world, there's also a lot of love. There are people that care for him. And I think we make our own world. It's the only world he knows. And so while in some ways, I'm sure to the reader it seems a very strange place, an alien place, as I said. But it's also, I think there are a lot of ways in which his life is similar to our own. There are connections between his world and our world, and he, as far as he's concerned, it's the only world he knows, and he has by the standards of the day, a fairly happy, normal life, with some unusual events in the midst of it.
Well, one of the key characters is Father Hermit, I guess, for lack of a better term. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little about that particular character. And he seems to sort of take on sort of a father figure in some ways, but maybe perhaps more of a spiritual father for this particular character.
That's a good point. He is very much, I think, a surrogate father, as are some of the other monks, but particularly Father Gweneth the Hermit, who he also refers to him as Father Hermit. This is an interesting time in England. The 7th century in England, there are actually two forms of Catholicism prevalent in the land at this point. There's Celtic Catholicism, which is an old Roman Britain form of Catholicism that St. Patrick was a Celtic Catholic. This is from when the Roman Empire still extended up into England, but the church was very young, and so practices hadn't been set in stone yet. For instance, the dating of Easter was done differently by the Celtic Catholics. They had a very different attitude toward prayer. They were in some ways, much more mystical. Hermits were a big part of their practice and living in monasteries. At the same time, in the 7th century, Roman Catholicism is beginning to come into England, and so you have this clash between these two different forms of Catholicism. The hermit, Father Gweneth, represents a little bit of both, which is sort of what we all ended up with. Roman Catholicism eventually adopted a lot of the Celtic Catholic practices. Probably, hybridization is always a good idea, and it's probably good for the church. But at any rate, at this point, this is when that conflict is still occurring. The hermit initially has grown up as a Celtic Catholic. Because of a vow he's taken, he can't ever leave the top of this mountain he's living on, called Modrenecht, which is right next to the monastery. So when the Roman Catholics come up and basically usurp the power of the Celtic Catholics that hold this monastery, and it becomes a Roman Catholic monastery, Gweneth, because he's taken this vow, has no choice. He continues to stay on and adopts the practices of the Roman Catholics. A lot of the Celtic Catholic monks would have done that, probably as much as 50% of them. But so he's from both worlds. He's both the mystical, and he at least has contact with that more sophisticated, cosmopolitan, continental Catholicism emanating up from Rome.
And now, turning to his real father, who visits him at least once in the book, he comes off as very almost secular, very brash. I do not get a sense that he has a great deal of necessarily respect for the monastery or the monks, although he may respect the fact that they exist nonetheless as a force. Tell me a little bit about how he fits in, and particularly this encounter that he has with his own son, because there's only like one encounter that we really see.
That's right. Ceolwulf is the father's name, and I imagined him as what I think was probably a fairly common creature of the time period. He's an Anglo-Saxon warrior who grew up a pagan. A lot of these people would have grown up pagans, and came into contact first with the Celtic Catholic Church, began to sort of adopt those practices because it was what his king wanted him to do, and then Roman Catholicism came along, and by his eyes, cynical eyes of a warrior, it all looks kind of silly. And so you're absolutely right. I don't think he has a lot of respect for the monastery or any of the things that are going on there. The flip side of that is he's a political animal, and he recognizes the power of the church, and he certainly recognizes the power of his king. His king has set an example of donating children. The king, Oswu, this is historically accurate. All the background information in this novel is historically accurate. And his king, Oswu, did in fact donate one of his children to a monastery. Because of that, when Ceolwulf, Winweed's father, wants to do likewise in order to ingratiate himself with his king, and so that's the reason he donates Winweed. He hopes to gain political favor from it.
And this sort of sets us up to the problem that faces our main character, which is on the one hand, he certainly has this devotion to the monastery and Catholicism. On the other hand, his father is asking him to pray for the death of the bishop. And this sort of sets up this internal conflict. Tell me a little bit about how he's reacting, how he grapples with this contradiction that he has in his life between his real father on the one hand and his sort of church father on the other.
Good for you. You read this book closely. I'm impressed. Because that is the central issue for him. And fatherhood is certainly one of, if not the main theme of this book, is who is our father? That's the question Winweed's asking himself all the time. He can barely remember his father, but he has all these fathers in the monastery, some of whom are really kind, good men. And then out of the blue, this man appears. By this time Winweed's probably 11 or 12, something like that. This man appears, and he's a charming fellow. He goes to some lengths to charm his own son. Before after working at him for a while and getting him on his side, announces that the real reason he's come is that he wants Winweed to learn how to pray better, so that he can pray for the destruction of Ceolwulf's major enemy, who turns out to be the boy's rightful superior, his bishop. And so suddenly this kid who has initially been so happy, my father, my natural father has finally come back to visit me. He's dreamt of this all his life. And at the end of it, he asked him to pray for the destruction of the only fathers he's known who've been kind to him. That's a rough row to hoe, boy. And when you think about what we all go through as we're growing up, this is a child growing up, and children grew up, they had the same hormonal urges, the same things, the same wishes and desires that we have today. It was natural in this time period too to want to rebel against your own fathers. Well, the only fathers he knows are these monks, and so to have his natural father come out of the blue and ask him in effect to rebel against these people, in some ways to an adolescent is almost a bit of a gift. But he's still enough a product of the monastery that he's terrified by the notion of praying for the destruction of his bishop. So it's a real dilemma for the kid, and in a way that shows that he's beginning to sort of grow up, and is typical even today. Instead of making it a black and white decision, he initially sort of compromises and says, he hedges his bets and says, I'm going to go ahead and learn how to pray really well from the hermit, and once I get good at this, then if I can work up the courage, I will pray for the destruction of my bishop, but I can't bring myself to do that right away.
It brings me to the issue of prayer. You've been quoted saying for your novel's protagonist and the Benedictine monks who train and oversee him, prayer is a primal force, almost palpable as a reality. Because that's one of the interesting things, is that this is not just simply about practical politics, even his father, who may be very skeptical about the monks and how they live their lives, nonetheless accept this idea that there's something beyond just simply the reality in front of him. He's not a complete existential figure, as it were.
No, he certainly isn't.
So talk a little bit about the role that prayer and this sort of, lack of a word, perhaps mystical sense about Christianity and this thought process that went on at the monastery.
Good for you. Well, that was part of the fun for me, of trying to reimagine the 7th century and travel back there to write this book. It's part of the fun of writing literary historical fiction. And if I've done a good job of it, it should be part of the fun for the reader as well. Was that I knew it was a time, science, for all intents and purposes, everything that we take for granted today, science, our understanding of the solar system, our understanding of the way the universe works, physics, all of that, none of it existed. And instead there were different mythologies that floated around, and one of them, the one that I happen to follow myself even to this day, is Christianity, and people believed it pretty wholeheartedly. There was no reason to doubt anything else. But that's not the case today. So that was a challenge for me, to try to imagine a world in which prayer, for instance, would have the primal force of fire, as you put it. I like that. And you know what the way that I finally was able to put my mind there and create this world, the image that really helped me, when I first started working on the book, I don't know, golly, it was 15 years ago. It was a long time ago. I happened to see a photograph. There had been an earthquake somewhere in the Middle East. I can't remember now where. It may have been Afghanistan. And there was a photo, and thousands of people had been killed. It was a terrible earthquake. And there was a photograph that's taken shortly thereafter of a little girl who'd lost her entire family. And she's walking down a street, and she's suddenly, there are two men in the background, I remember, that are like Pushtun tribesmen or something, and they're sort of looking at her with this curious look on her face, because she has suddenly turned and looked up at the sky, and she's arguing with God. She's ticked off at God for killing her family, and there's this look of utter outrage on her face, and the tribesmen are watching her in a similar fashion, like, oh, well, it'll be interesting to see whether he answers. And I thought, that's it. That's the world I want to capture. I want to go back to a time when that sort of certainty existed, when people might turn and literally look at the sky and talk at it, expecting an answer. That's the world of the 7th century.
At the same time, what I thought was interesting, and it struck me later in the book with the second pestilence, is that even though he lives in this world, the way you write it, there are very practical scientific things that are occurring. The pestilence, for instance, was one of them, where it comes through, kills some people. The second time it comes through, it basically kills all the people who weren't there the first time, which we tend to now think, oh, yes.
Immunity,
sure. Right, that's exactly. But he obviously...
he has no clue, yeah.
Right, he has no clue, and really almost attributes something that's beyond the physical to this particular effect.
Sure, oh yeah. That's, one of the nice things about writing about the 7th century from the point of view of the 21st is that I do have science, and so I can at one and the same time create a fairly realistic environment, because I know how that environment worked in the same way that I know the way our natural world worked, including things like immunity. And I can see how, given the immunities that would develop in people, to someone who had no idea about antibodies or anything like that, they would think, oh, that person is sacred in some way. That person has some sort of protection that must be the result of prayer or a connection with God. They have to come up with explanations. In a way, it's almost a scientific method. They want a reason too. Their reasons just happen to be different from ours. And in the final analysis, Don, something that I kept reminding myself as I was writing the book, who knows? We think we're right. But, our science, every now and then they kind of go, well, I'm not sure. And with quantum physics, it gets real iffy. So I was always respectful of their beliefs, I hope, and found them, the more I explored them and wrote about them, the more interesting I found them, and the more I sympathized with them, the more I found myself thinking, there are things these people have to teach us, that having that sort of certainty sometimes confers a certain wisdom that we lack in the modern world, because we're caught up with there's so much information at our beck and call that it can be confusing.
Well, I want to return to the issue of prayer, because one of the interesting things was that, as you mentioned, this is almost a meditative kind of prayer that the hermit father, for instance, says he should pursue. And so he does pursue it, basically to wipe out all thoughts and simply accept whatever God has to say to him. Mm-hmm. But in the process, he finds that perhaps as he wipes out all those thoughts and becomes sort of this blank slate from which to allow God in, he also fears that he can allow the devil in.
Yeah, now that's an interesting part of the book. I agree. And to be quite honest, that is not mentioned a lot in the literature about contemplative prayer, although it is mentioned from time to time. If you read The Cloud of Unknowing, for instance, which is a famous treatise on contemplative prayer written by an anonymous monk, I think maybe in the 17th century or 16th, way back there. One of the things that he talks about is that this kind of prayer shouldn't be attempted by just anyone. You have to really know what you're doing. And the implication always is that if you, in contemplative prayer, what you humble yourself before God. You do away with thought, is your desire. You try to empty yourself of thoughts, of self, of everything, and leave yourself blank in a sense, so that God can come into you and write upon you, as it were. And yes, certainly to the medieval mind, and to a degree to my own, I will admit, that there is the notion that perhaps you leave yourself open to whatever that wants to come in. Certainly it has been my own experience. I've tried to practice contemplative prayer. It's helped me a lot in my life. It is striking to me that it doesn't happen a lot, but every now and then, when you think you're being your best, you're being a good guy, you're trying to do what God wants you to do, or what you hope, if there is a God, you hope that he likes what you're doing, because you're listening for him, you'll find your thoughts suddenly becoming kind of improper.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we won't go into any more depth of that, but
yeah.
I am a human being, and I'm a male human being, and that sort of proximity between the sacred and the profane at such a moment can be startling. And I found myself thinking, for an adolescent, I can't imagine what it'd be like, because I remember my adolescence. As an adolescent male, the profane was right there whenever I wanted it in my thoughts.
Right.
And I thought, I'll bet it would be for him as well. And so that is a part of the novel as well. He doesn't act upon any of these thoughts, but he's horrified occasionally by the fantasies and imaginings that wander into his mind at the very moment when he's trying his hardest to reach God.
Now, as a matter of fact, there are a couple of female characters in here, particularly one woman that he kind of constantly thinks about, and I don't know whether it's that he's thinking about himself as praying for her, overseeing her. Tell us a little bit about that, particularly the one woman he sits down with, that sits down with the berries and so on. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I think Winweed's uncertain about it himself, ambivalent. I think he's in love with her, but he can't, as an oblate, he can't allow himself to admit that to himself. So what he tells himself is that he's praying for her. It's his dream that she may someday become a nun. Indeed, and this is true in the 7th century, and this is part of Celtic Catholicism again, there used to be monasteries that were both male and female. They lived celibate lives, but they lived together. And so it's even his dream that someday that he and Ainfleet might live in such a combined monastery. All of this, I think, is just a cover for his real intent, which is that I think he has at the very least a mad crush on this. It's the only girl that, even today, monasteries are secluded places, and within my lifetime, there used to have a sign on the front at Gethsemane that any woman beyond this point risks excommunication. Women were not allowed. And in the 7th century, it would have been even stricter observance of those kinds of rules. So you're right. He runs into 2 females in the whole book. I just lost a lot of readers. I know. What? No sex? He runs into 2 females in the entire book. Both of them, because they're so rare, are very important events. But on both occasions, those are big events in his life. And one of them, Ainfleet, for the rest of his life, that one encounter, he carries with him sort of a torch.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem as if it's much more of a spiritual encounter in which he fuses that normal desire. Another thing I wanted to get at is that, and I think it's toward the end of the book, he talks about how God may be wild. That he comes to conclusion, and he looks at the monastery, which has all these rules, and they're trying to sort of fit things together so they all make sense. And one of the things it struck me, for instance, whether it's the Book of Job or Ecclesiastes or whatever, there is this discussion, particularly in the Old Testament, about why do bad things happen to good people, and that there are these rules, and why don't they work? And he seems to come to the conclusion that despite all the efforts of the monastery, God is still a wild, unpredictable,
unknowable. Yeah, certainly. And in my own experience of prayer, that has been the sort of God I've encountered. It's the sort of God he encounters in the book. And I think in many ways it's the God we all encounter in our lives. He is unpredictable. We try as best we can. We're humans. We're frail. We're not sure, but we try as best we can to follow what we think, hope, pray are his precepts. But he surprises us all the time. And in many times, he surprises us in ways that are wonderful. But sometimes, when he rips people that we love from our lives and takes them from us forever without any explanation, people that we prayed for, people who were good, they still go. And it hurts. It hurts bad. It's hard at times like that not to think, and in a way it's good, I suppose. I can't control God, boy, and I really can't. And anybody who claims to be able to, I think, is deluding themselves. And that's his experience. I think to a degree it's our experience today. If there is a God, and I hope and pray there is a God, it'd pay off a lot of mortgages. Then I think we have to admit to ourselves, he is a supreme being, and his ways are not our ways. We cannot ever pretend to understand him. We can just only hope to maybe, if we're fortunate, touch him.
By the way, there's another character in this. I call him the furnace monk. He takes care of the furnace and so on. Tell me a little bit about him, but also, he eventually there's this calamity that occurs to him, and he doesn't seem to quite relate to the other monks. He seems to be much more practical as opposed to them being perhaps more spiritual.
Sure. Victricius is his name. He's a wonderful monk. I get a kick out of him. He also, two of the monks in the monastery, and this would have been common at this time, are actually from Gaul. They're not Anglo-Saxons. And as I said, the Roman Catholics are coming up from the continent at this point, so they're beginning to creep into monasteries. And Victricius is an example of one of these. He is, and monks are people just like anybody else. They're different personalities. He happens to be that type, and I love people like this. I wish I was one who, they can't see something broken without wanting to fix it. They always have to be doing something, and they're good at it. They can fix anything, tinker with it all day, and never notice the day is passing them by because they're having so much fun trying to fix it. He's that kind of personality. Unfortunately, in a monastery, especially one like Redstone, where serenity is a value, the notion of someone being active in that way, constantly, always having to fix something, is a little bit off-putting to the other monks. Then add into that the fact that he's a foreigner, and this is a very parochial time. This is a time when everybody is provincial. Their region is the best region on the planet, and everything else is suspect. So he's a foreigner. He's overactive, and he also is pretty bright, and they need him. His furnace brings wealth and power to the monastery in the form of iron that is sold to the surrounding kingdoms. And then finally, he's a pretty bright guy, and as a result, he's the one who recognizes the first signs they see that a pestilence is coming, the plague. And so he's the one who tells the monastery, hey, look, guys, all these little animals dying, that's not good. I think we're in for it. Nobody likes, the bearer of bad tidings is rarely welcomed with open arms. And so all these things add up to Victricius being unpopular. But he's also, and I think this is also true of that kind of personality that likes to tinker, it doesn't really bother him that much as long as he's got something to tinker with. Right. It gives him a purpose, and so he's a very interesting character to me, and he becomes close to my main character, Winwy, who's eventually assigned to work in the furnace.
Because one of the things that struck me about it is that his world seemed to contrast, as it were, his focus on the material world seems to contrast with this sort of spirituality that surrounds him. And you also have, I think, one of the villagers who comes in, who brings a coal, I guess, in.
Oh, right, sure.
And he's sort of other sort of strange figure, and the two of them combined seem to represent the outside world.
They do, and I think that's a good point. Stuf is the name of the outsider. He's actually a pagan. He's the only, there may be another pagan we meet in the book, but Stuf we know for sure is a pagan at a time when they're kind of frightening bunch. And so, yes, you're right. It is both Stoof and Victricus, and the furnace yard itself, where the furnace operates. All of that is the outside world. Here's this monastery that's meant to be this quiet, contemplative, prayerful place, and then here's this furnace yard where they go that's really almost industrial in a sense. I mean, they're breaking rocks up and they're firing them, and it's a blast furnace. They've got a pretty good sized bellows they use to blow a blast into it. It's a remarkable furnace at a time when in England especially that sort of technology was almost unheard of. They're creating significant amounts of iron that can then be turned into steel and swords. So it's in swords. Right. This is a monastery, right? Okay, but they're creating implements of war. They don't actually make the swords themselves, but the material that they produce does. So it is a contrast and a bit of a paradox that this place even exists.
And finally, of course, we have the monastery itself becomes embroiled in the real world outside because they have a new bishop that comes in, and suddenly the old abbot is out, and a new person comes in. And it almost sounds as if, in many ways, that the world is now full of secrets, that there are secret agendas. And one of the things that, particularly early on in the book, your main character talks about the idea that the first secret that he holds seems to pull him away from the spirituality that he so wants and so desires.
Good for you. Yeah, you're absolutely right. His initial secret. The first time that he doesn't share through confession or in any other form something, he begins to feel for the first time that he's removed, in a sense, from the kingdom. And we all, I think, remember what that was like in childhood when we first began experimenting with things that we thought our parents probably wouldn't really approve of, and yet we were just old enough to not admit it. And so suddenly we held this part of ourselves aloof. And yes, I think that is an important moment for him. And it's you're right too that the larger world, in a similar way, the larger world has similar secrets, and that those then intrude upon the monastery too. And I hadn't thought about that, but the one sort of mirrors the other. I like that. That's a good idea. And isn't that the way of life? The best places that you ever worked in your life, it's maddening how outside influences can suddenly come in and disrupt everything. The economy falls apart, or another company buys your company and they change the rules, or who knows what. But there are always outside influences that affect us, and the same is true in this world.
Well, we were speaking with William Peake. He is the author of The Oblate's Confession, a new book out about 7th century monastery in England, and it was a fascinating book to read, and it was nice, and particularly in terms of its interior quality. I appreciate you stopping by.
Thank you very much for having me, Don.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.